Thank you so much, organizers, for inviting me to this excellent conference. And when I look at this agenda, I see it is very rich content and very renowned speakers. This morning or this afternoon, I should say, we heard Professor Land Pritchett. And in line with that, actually, what I'm going to present here today is a challenge of structural transformation in South Asia. The story is that I'll talk briefly about what do you mean by structural transformation, and then what is the kind of status of South Asia in terms of structural transformation and the kind of challenges the South Asian countries are facing. So I will not really make an aggregate of South Asian countries. I have picked 5 South Asian countries, 5 leading South Asian countries: Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And I have also tried to make a comparison of these 5 countries with some 2 or 3 countries in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Malaysia, to some extent. So let's see how we actually see this structural transformation and the kind of challenges. So I think all of us know that what by structural transformation we mean a shift of economic activity from a less to a more productive sector, which spurs economic development in the classical school of economic theory, for example, from Lewis or Calder, as well as pioneers of sectoral-based analysis in development economics, such as Chenery, Hirschman, and Midrell. We have seen this kind of mentioning of structural transformation and its importance. And why is it important? Because the major factor, I'm just trying to say in one single sentence, but there could be many, many explanations to that. But I try to emphasize on that particular point that the major factor differentiating successful countries from unsuccessful ones is the pace at which this structural transformation unfolds. So I think to some extent, the way Professor Land Pritchett actually he was comparing countries with respect to the growth in per capita income and the kind of associated differently structural transformation, which also brings with the growth of per capita income. I think that really makes how there are some successful countries and there are some unsuccessful countries. So let's have a look at the economic growth performance in South Asia. And when we talk about this economic growth performance, we mean annual GDP growth rate. So here I have plotted the 5 South Asian countries, and since 1972, so almost last 50 years. So that was the whole idea. So last 50 years, what is the kind of growth or experience in terms of GDP growth experience, annual GDP growth experience of the 5 South Asian countries? You can see that while Bangladesh has a kind of gradual rise, but when in the GDP growth rate, India's performance is also remarkable in certain period. India has episodic very high economic growth, but kind of if you can see in terms of stability of the growth rate is not that great as Bangladesh actually achieved. Nepal actually experienced a kind of secular decline. Sri Lanka is also kind of, you can see that kind of decline. And in Pakistan's case, as we have been hearing from other speakers, is the growth story has not been that great. So in terms of economic growth in South Asia, we are seeing very mixed picture. India performed well. India made a lot of progress and also had very high degree of economic growth in certain episodes, but high degree of volatility as well. In contrast, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan, they had some periods of high growth, but over the years, if you take a very longer time horizon, there is a kind of secular decline. But in contrast, Bangladesh is kind of appears as a different story, where it has a kind of secular rise. Probably we can forget the very recent episode of COVID, but in general, these countries actually had this kind of growth episodes. Now, this table is interesting. What I really wanted to do, I want to make comparison of these 5 countries of South Asia with China and Vietnam. Now, this is a very interesting story, which actually is unfold here. You see, in 1985, all these 7 countries, they had almost similar per capita GDP, around 250 to 350 US dollars. You can see what I have done here, that I have made Bangladesh per capita GDP as one in 1985, and then I have just made other ones in proportion to Bangladesh's per capita GDP. You can see that India had a higher per capita GDP than Bangladesh, Nepal, of course, had lower per capita GDP. Pakistan has almost 1.4 times of per capita GDP than Bangladesh in 1985. Sri Lanka had 1.5 times. China's per capita GDP was actually lower than India's per capita GDP in 1985. And Vietnam's per capita GDP was much lower than Bangladesh's, was much lower than per capita GDP of Bangladesh, and of course, much lower than of that of Pakistan. Now, what happened in 2020? You can see in 2020, things got radically changed. Bangladesh's per capita GDP suppressed India's and of course Pakistan's and Nepal's as well. So in South Asia, Bangladesh appeared as a kind of very good performer compared to the other South Asian countries. But when you make a comparison of even Bangladesh with other two countries outside of South Asia, definitely China and Vietnam, they had remarkable experience. China from 294 US dollar, they crossed more than $10,000 over the same period. And they actually increased their per capita GDP by more than 35 times. And Vietnam by 15 times. So Vietnam's per capita GDP is 1.56 times of Bangladesh's per capita GDP in 2020. So in South Asia, what we found that Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, they had around 9 to 10% of growth in per capita GDP when you compare 2020 over 1985. But the performance of Pakistan was not that great. And India had a bit of moderate performance, and Nepal as well had some moderate performance. So with this kind of comparison, that when we make a comparison amongst ourselves, probably that tells you one part of the story, and that also definitely is a good part of the story. But we need to compare ourselves. Ourselves means the South Asian countries with some of the very good performers outside of South Asia, and here China and Vietnam, they appear at some very good performers. Now, I also try to look at the structural change in GDP because we are talking about structural transformation. Now, let's have a look at the structural change in GDP in these countries, in these 5 countries. So Bangladesh actually faced an episode of, you can see the growing importance of industry and falling agriculture. Of course, the blue part is agriculture and the gray part is services, and the yellow part is the industry. India kind of, in the recent years, they actually can see this yellow part is kind of that part is shrinked in recent years. Nepal, in any case, they had a very small share of industry. Pakistan also kind of you can see the kind of a static position of that industry share. And by industry, I have to mention here that it includes construction. So when I will show you what is happening to the manufacturing sector, then the story actually becomes a bit different. And Sri Lanka as well, you can see that the industry share remained kind of stagnant. So in terms of employment, in all these 5 countries, agriculture still dominates in terms of share in employment. And Nepal has definitely a very large share of agriculture in terms of total employment. And you can see in the case of Pakistan, the share did not change much, the blue part. In Bangladesh, the share declined, in India as well, but not very significantly. Still in Bangladesh, more than around 40% of employment is in agriculture. To some extent, Sri Lanka actually had a bit of a reduced rate of share of agriculture in total employment, around 20%. So this is the figure probably we'd like to be more interested in, that what is the manufacturing share in GDP, because when it comes to structural transformation, as I said, moving from low productive to a high productive sector, and we see that probably except Bangladesh, this red line is except Bangladesh, which is actually growing, other South Asian countries, they are experiencing a fall in share of manufacturing share, falling manufacturing share in GDP in recent years. So this is something I would say that probably it's a question mark whether we are experiencing a premature kind of deindustrialization in South Asian countries. And this is something comes from one of my very recent work, where I actually showed that India is actually facing a premature deindustrialization. How? Here I have plotted, you can see that log of per capita GDP here in the x-axis and the manufacturing value added share in GDP in the y-axis. Malaysia is also experiencing a falling share of in manufacturing GDP, but at a very high level of per capita GDP. That means what is happening in Malaysia is not premature deindustrialization. It is at a more matured level of deindustrialization, and that happened in many European countries as well. While Bangladesh still going up in terms of manufacturing value added, in Indian case, what we are seeing a falling share of manufacturing value added at a very low level of per capita GDP compared to what we have observed in Malaysia. So that raised the big concerns whether India is the biggest economy in South Asia, around 70% or more than 70% of GDP, South Asian GDP, and it shows that there is a big concern where the premature deindustrialization probably is taking place in India. I have some, there's another slide too, and this comes from one of the recent books, The Developer's Dilemma, Structural Transformation, Inequality Dynamics, and Inclusive Growth. And this is a book edited by 4 authors, and I have worked closely with them, and especially with Professor Kunal Sen. So where we try to actually understand that what are the dynamics of industrialization in different countries. So if we have manufacturing value-added share in the x-axis here, and where if it is increasing, and this manufacturing employment share is in the y-axis, then if they are stuck somewhere in the middle, then we call them stalled industrialization. And if we are seeing some advanced level of industrialization where the manufacturing value is increasing, probably the employment is not, in terms of share in GDP, is not really increasing that much. That is kind of advanced industrialization. But we are also seeing the upgrading industrialization in so many of the developing countries, where, especially Southeast Asian countries and East Asian countries, where both the shares of employment and GDP of manufacturing actually increased. So with this kind of framework, and also we are seeing the secular deindustrialization, where both the shares declining, and the primary industrialization, where probably we are experiencing some employment share, rise in employment share, but not that much of value-added, rise in value-added share of manufacturing. So with this kind of framework, what we did in my chapter in this particular book, I applied that, and then we found that the Bangladesh case actually still is experiencing the upgrading industrialization, especially with respect to the share of manufacturing value-added and share of manufacturing employment. So probably that is one very interesting case in South Asia, where the Bangladesh case appears to demonstrate that the country is still experiencing upgrading industrialization. In contrast, in India, I have showed you earlier in one of my works, but this is the paper in the same volume done by Selim Raihan and Sabyasachi Kaur. They have shown that actually at certain point, India's Indian case actually moved from advanced industrialization to primary industrialization. They declined after this, they actually stepped back. And then there is a fall to secular deindustrialization too. So as I have showed you earlier, that comparison of India with Malaysia, this story of Selim Raihan and Sabyasachi Kaur in their chapter also actually resembles the kind of findings what I have found in my own work. Unfortunately, we didn't have any chapter on Pakistan in that particular volume, but I'm quite sure that the kind of findings or the analysis on Bangladesh and India would be helpful for understanding the challenges in Pakistan as well. So when you talk about structural transformation, it's not only the transformation with respect to increasing share of manufacturing value and employment, but at the same time, whether that is contributing to rising inequality. So I'll not spend time here, but I just want to mention that in the same volume, we found that the kind of structural transformation which has taken place in South Asia, it has actually what we call on the top corner, the box is the Kuznets-Shian tension, the strong tension. Whereas you have this structural transformation, but at the same time, there is the inequality, rising inequality as well in South Asia. Actually, we analyzed through different episodes as well. And that means the kind of structural transformation which is taking place in South Asia is not inequality reducing. It is actually, and probably we can bring in the other issues of inclusive growth as well. It's not really inclusive in that sense. Now, I will also bring in, there are two other aspects which come from my very recent work, and I'm contributing that chapter or that paper to UNESCO's one forthcoming volume, is that I'm also telling, in addition to the premature deindustrialization, most of the South Asian countries, I think including Bangladesh as well, they are facing premature declining share of trade in GDP, trade orientation. So the top figure is for Malaysia, and Malaysia is also facing falling trade GDP ratio, but at a very high level of per capita income. And you can see Malaysia already has a very high level of trade GDP ratio. But look at the other South Asian countries for this period. They had a falling trade GDP ratio in general. The common story is that their trade orientation is falling, and which actually is related to their trade policy and a lack of effort to or success in diversifying the export basket, and many other related issues. What I'll tell at the at the end when I try to summarize. What I also observed, and this is something what I'm going to present here, that in terms of export composition, the South Asian countries are actually not doing really great compared to what Vietnam. So you can see Bangladesh is have a very highly concentrated export basket. Pakistan is not too different because Pakistan has also a very high share of textile garments. Sri Lanka's export basket is diversified, but again, not very high value-added exports. And India's case as well, though India's export basket is diversified, but when it comes to, if you compare India's export basket with Vietnam's, the kind of high value-added products are there. India's export basket is still dominated by very agricultural products, mineral products, and not very high value-added products, and let alone Nepal's export basket, where we see very high dominance of the service sectors. So in terms of export basket as well, we are not seeing a kind of structural transformation, very high successful structural transformation in South Asian countries. Another point, another premature thing, what is happening in South Asia, which is not really helping them for meaningful structural transformation, what we call the premature falling FDI GDP ratio, or premature falling FDI orientation. Except the very recent year in India, in general, the South Asian countries, these recent years, you can see, observe a falling FDI GDP ratio. And we know that probably except India in recent years, South Asian countries are not very successful when it comes to attracting FDI. I have just plotted Malaysia's and Vietnam's FDI GDP ratio, though they also experience some fluctuations, but in general, you can see Vietnam, their FDI GDP ratio is more than 4%, and Malaysia as well, except in recent year, they maintain a very high level of FDI GDP ratio. So I think I'm at the very end of my last slide, is that when I talk about the success of what are needed for successful structural transformation, here I'd like to highlight four major areas. First, I think I have already mentioned that there are some policy-induced challenges, especially when it comes to trade policy, when it comes to FDI policy, and when it comes to policies related to export diversification. So most of the South Asian countries, they are facing a lot of challenges in terms of getting their policies right. Second one, a lot of supply side constraints in the form of weak infrastructure and high cost of doing business. This is common across almost all the South Asian countries. Probably Indian case is bit better, but when you take India's by states, as well as in some cases the aggregate figures hide some of the very differences at the very state level or at the ground level. So in general, these supply side constraints they don't really help diversification of the economy as well as diversification of the export basket. All the South Asian countries, they suffer from lack of human capital. They invest still very low on education and health. If you look at the public expenditure on health and education, in general, South Asian countries, they don't spend high compared to their peers in Southeast Asian countries. And very finally, some of the institutional and political challenges, I think I'm quite happy that my earlier presenter, he also highlighted some of the very important institutional challenges when it comes to getting the right kind of incentives, providing right kind of incentives for structural transformation or economic diversification, and some of the political economic challenges in terms of rent-seeking behaviors, in terms of cronyism, and we have seen that there are many dominance of cronies in many of the South Asian countries, which inhibit getting the policies right, getting a right kind of industrial policy or broad-based industrial policy. I think all these deter, having a meaningful or successful structural transformation in South Asian countries. And we have to get our policies right. We have to get our supply side constraints right, and get them, and especially get the right kind of infrastructure, get the right kind of human capital, and of course, solve many of the institutional challenges what many of the South Asian countries they face. I'll stop here and thank you very much for giving me this talk.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Selim Raihan. You have really dived deep into the issues of a very specific type of experience, growth experience that all the South Asian countries seem to be caught up in, and some are doing better than others. But nevertheless, when you compare the South Asian experience with the Southeast Asian experience, there are differences. And a deeper question is that will South Asia be able to break out of its development or underdevelopment trap or trajectory, or we do not have the enabling environment? Because I think every year when we get together, we do talk of the same kind of political and institutional constraints that just don't seem to be tackled as even time is going by. I'm trying to relate it to my presentation. They are almost like gender and social norms. So maybe it's the time has come to talk about political norms. I mean, why are political norms so obstinate and so unchangeable in South Asia that, they're keeping South Asia back from its potential? So with this, I really thank you once again. And I wish you were here to get your memento, and we will keep it for you. So next time when you come to Pakistan, you can claim it from Dr. Bushra. And hopefully you will not suffer a long power outage. That is, at least we have something in common. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.